the Fire Next Time book, which came out the following year. I had started freelancing with Life, and I asked them if I could do an essay with Baldwin, because I just started doing essays with them as well. They agreed, he agreed, and so starting in January 1963, I traveled with Baldwin. We started off in Harlem. We went to North Carolina. We went to Mississippi, and we went to New Orleans. It was quite interesting and intense in the sense that James really was amazing in terms of the trip. I would say I've met many people who, or not many people, but I met a lot of people who live on really on having a crucial moment at some point in the course of a day, and we certainly had that almost every day. It seemed to be part of Baldwin's life. I mean, we never made an airplane by more than 2 minutes, and usually we had a charter out, but there always was a crisis going on. At the same time, his mind worked so furiously, and he was so intent that his ideas flowed constantly. So we talked very, very fast in terms of everything. For me, it was an experience, having lived in New York all that time up to there. And we started off, and I began to see a world which I had perhaps read about, but I had never quite seen. And there's quite a difference in that. So there's a symbol, I have some pictures here from the Fire Next Time book that we have, and but I'm on the wrong thing somehow.
Let's do, they're up there, but they're not there.
Stay with us. It'll all be fine.
There we go. There.
Cool. All right, so these are some images of Jimmy, and then some images really of the civil rights movement.
It isn't changing yet.
Oh, never mind. I could sing. You wouldn't want to hear it. So basically, through Jimmy, I met an enormous amount of leaders of the civil rights movement, and it really encouraged me to spend much more time in the South. And so from 1963 through 1968, I spent a lot of time in the South covering, I covered the Selma March, I covered various other things. I met with a lot of leaders. I first met people like Jerome Smith, who we'll talk about. Cool, here we go. So, yay! So we started off in Harlem, and we got to know each other then. The picture, which really means a lot to me, is this picture, which is, Do You Love Me? And I felt it was an intrinsic attitude that connected me with Baldwin. And I felt strongly, it's a particularly emotional picture for me, because somehow it brings to me so much of him. We traveled in Harlem, and there's a famous bookstore there, and he's with his nephew at the time. We spent time, going to his office and in and out, and this is really his family, who he's very, very close to. It's very strange that most of the Baldwin men died very early. The women have survived right now, but I really loved his brother David also, who traveled with him quite a bit, and who also was intense And a picture I particularly love is from Louisiana, from New Orleans. And it really is another aspect of Baldwin's life, which we don't normally see that much of, or normally didn't see that much of. But he had such a love for people, and particularly a love for kids in every way. We had a lot of talks because he was doing a book tour throughout the South. And we met a lot of liberals who really weren't liberal, and a lot of people who sort of charged at him and really differed very much in terms of the attitudes that he was progressing and talking about. We visited with Medgar Evers, and Medgar took a towel and put it over the license plate of our rented car. And it was really as a joke because everything was under surveillance at that time. And he knew well that that was happening. And a few months later, in June, he was shot in his driveway by Beckwith, was one of the most foremost segregationists at the time. We visited with James Meredith, and I was in a situation was anti-segregation in the sense that they could go all out for dinner, but they couldn't take me with them, so I had to stay in the house while they went to eat. Baldwin had an enormous love for kids, and this picture is, again, one of my favorites. It was taken in Durham, North Carolina, and it's really about an abandoned child who'd been taken in by this family. And I was very, very impressed with just Baldwin's warmth and kindness and just sense of connection with this boy. It's interesting in terms of photography that if you look at the picture, and if you were just to cover up everything except Baldwin's face, it would be a good picture. If you included just Baldwin and the abandoned child, it would be a better picture. But by showing just the milieu and everything around it, it becomes a much better picture. And photography works that way. And I think really as a photographer, you have to look for the pluses and try to find ways to, after you're satisfied with what you have, to try to do better, including using a clicker. Again, just his feeling with kids, he spent time everywhere when he saw kids. This is a picture which has been very popular, which was at JoJo's Chicken Place in New Orleans. And it just has a sense of just the culture at the time in terms of all the writing on the wall there. We also in Durham, Carolina, abhorred the idea of any black people coming anywhere near them. So we took this picture in front of the colored entrance door, and you can see that the person inside the soda shop is looking out and wondering what we're doing, and probably not happy about it. Baldwin had great respect for Malcolm X, particularly when he broke with Muhammad. And whereas at the time, the general press was very much against Malcolm, and he was extremely controversial, Baldwin really saw his importance and just his point of view, which I'm sure you'll talk about. This is Baldwin with Joan Baez at the end of the Selma March. And this is a picture of Baldwin just being saluted by Bayon Rustin and by A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph was very responsible in terms of the March in Washington movement. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes, but you just saw the enormous respect that they had for him. He never was so much a forefront person, but behind the scenes he was very important. One of the things, again, in your book, oh,
I move, sorry.
hello! One of the important things which is in the book is about the meeting with Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy had felt that he and his brother had the black vote. And so they called this meeting at which predominantly Lorraine Hansberry and Baldwin and someone who had been one of the early freedom writers named Jerome Smith. And they attended the meeting, and again, Kennedy felt he was in for a lot of praise, but the result was it was quite the reverse, and they felt that the Kennedys had really done very little, and certainly not enough for the civil rights movement. In the meeting of the meeting, Jerome Smith said, "This meeting nauseates me," and that changed the whole tone of the meeting, and pretty much ended it. And Bobby had to go back to his brother and said, "We don't have the black vote." And from that point on, the Kennedys became much more involved in civil rights. Just an early picture, which I took during the Columbia riots in New York. I don't know if you can read it, probably you can. And it just represents an attitude at that time in terms of just the black community, particularly in New York at that time. I mentioned Jerome Smith. Jerome Smith was one of the, really, there was a whole group of civil rights workers who wore overalls, and they worked in the streets, and they tried to really build up volunteers and that sort. But the picture to me is very symbolic in the sense that the civil rights movement was nonviolent and also very church-directed. So Jerome Smith came to the March on Washington. Now at the March on Washington, everyone came dressed really well. It was a big, big event. Dr. King gave his speech, "I Have a Dream." There were signs from the AFL and CIO about demands and all these things, but everyone was in a jubilant mood. And Jerome Smith felt that protesters should really have lied on the track, or should lie on the tracks of the train station going out, so that it would be difficult for people to easily get home, with the idea that they had to realize that this was not so much a gala event, but only the very start of the movement, and that they had to really understand that there was so much to do in the future. I first met John Lewis in 1963 in Clarksdale, Mississippi. He was leading a group of ministers to a talk that Dr. King was giving there. And I have met him quite a number of times, and I really feel that John Lewis has really so much carried the cloak of the civil rights movement and just of what Dr. King started. And I think more than any of the people who have been involved in the movement who are still active in some way politically, he has expressed the most, and really it's amazing. I'm sorry he's not well, and that is going to be a big blow to everything, and to just a conscience and a voice of conscience that pervades everywhere. This is a picture of Dr. King, which I took in Selma, Alabama. And it's a particular picture I particularly liked at the time. Before that, I had photographed him in Birmingham. This is pretty much what one of the Birmingham churches looked like at the time. And we all know how really, I think he was, 26 when he first started out as this minister who came to Birmingham and really suddenly got the respect of all the other ministers there. And he developed such a strong voice in terms of everything and in terms of the movement after that and in terms of the strategy of the movement. Birmingham is one of the cities that most interests me in the sense that there was going to be a peaceful rally after all the protests and the bus situation and allowing taxis to drive people. And there was going to be a rally in a park there. And it probably would have been a peaceful rally with a lot of speeches and talk, but the troopers and the police turned their hoses on the crowd. They turned high-pressure hoses on the crowd, and also they set the dogs on people. And it was so horrendous. Unfortunately, there was a photographer named Charles Moore at the time who was there photographing for Life magazine. And Life ran the story of what was happening in Birmingham, probably 8 to 10 pages. And suddenly Life at that time had a circulation over 1 million. And suddenly people in America saw what was happening in the South. And it was a real turning point. It's one of those points where photojournalism really turned the country into realizing the horrendous situations that were happening at the time. This is J.B. Stoner, who was one of the big segregationist leaders at the time and one of the instigators of a lot of situations. I went to a rally in St. Augustine, and the first part of the rally really was a group of students, very well dressed, who came to a restaurant where they knew they would not be allowed in, but they wanted to make a point about what was happening. So they tried to get in. The manager of the restaurant came out to talk to them, to tell them to go away. And suddenly 2 troopers appeared behind them. And the troopers very casually led the group in the back where there was a paddy wagon. And gradually everyone was put into the paddy wagon. My wife loves a picture which I don't have here. And it's really like about a 12-year or 14-year-old boy helping this elderly lady into the paddy wagon. Because basically it was part of the movement. And it was understood that this was nonviolent and that the only way to really conquer all of this was the nonviolence movement. I had been in Durham, North Carolina, and I was talking to this girl, and she pointed to this sheriff, and she said, "You see that man? He caused me to spend 60 days in jail." But it wasn't said with anger or anything of that sort. It was almost said with a sense of pride in terms of what the movement was about and the sense of how you would succeed in the movement. It interests me that in Birmingham, because the protest would not have caused any interest if it had just remained the simple rally, but because the backlash against the protest was so stringent, it became a national event. And in so many events, the movement was conscious that protests very often were more successful when they were unsuccessful, or where there was a crowd where basically the opposition, the segregationists, were baited to do something ridiculous, like when 100 people appeared before Bull Connor's office and he arrested all of them. And when more people came, he arrested all of them. And suddenly Martin Luther King was in jail, and all of this was happening. But suddenly what you heard was about this ridiculous thing of just jailing more and more protesters, more and more nonviolent protesters. Another movement I was at was really in 1964, which was the what is called the Summer of '64. And Bob Moses had organized a group to come to Ohio and basically to discuss and to learn how they could go into Mississippi and deal with the voter registration problem. And what was happening in Mississippi is that if you, particularly in small towns, if you went and tried to register to vote, they would find some clause, oh, no, you don't qualify. You could be a college graduate and they would find, oh, no, I'm sorry. So it was a question of mobilizing people to come as a group into Mississippi and try to register. And it was successful. The other part of it was a literacy campaign. And really there were teachers there who spent time with particularly younger kids and going over stories with them, telling them stories. While we were at this learning session in Ohio, in Oxford, Ohio, word got out that a church had been bombed near Philadelphia, Mississippi. That Life had given me what you would call a stringer, who was someone who had grown up in Mississippi, and he had gone to Ole Miss, and he knew his ways around, and Life figured I needed someone to go to be with, in a way, to drive and just to travel with me. The first time I met him was in Jackson, Mississippi, and I had long hair, I had a leather jacket, and he took me into the local barber shop, and he told them that I had lost a bet and to give me a Marine haircut, close cropped. And then he took me out and he got me a red alligator shirt and white corduroy pants and a little transistor radio case, which I could put my camera in, and then he felt that he could walk around with me. He and I went to investigate this church, and on the way we heard about the fact that 3 civil rights workers had disappeared there. And so we came into the town of Philadelphia, and I saw this big burly sheriff standing maybe over there, and I started taking pictures from the car of him. And he came over and started walking towards me, and he came up to me, and he took the camera out of my hand, and he took the back of the camera, opened it, and pulled the film out, threw it on the ground, and then gave me back my camera. And it turned out he was one of the ringleaders in terms of the kidnapping of the 3 civil rights workers. So we were very lucky at that time, probably because I was there for life, and probably because the person with me really had a good Southern drawl. We were not, we were not put into major trouble. Dr. King, after the 2 attempts to start the Selma March off to cross Pettus Bridge, really talked to the crowd there in a strong way. And the crowd was mixed up with all kinds of people. There were a lot of nuns and people who were ministers who were there because suddenly this had become an important event. This is one of the pictures which means the most to me, in the sense that it so much reverberates today in terms of what is happening, Stop Police Killings. And I'll go quickly through this. You see a protester laughing at the troopers, not taking it like, oh my God, what's going to happen? We saw crowds coming off of the Pettus Bridge. This was a picture I took at the very start as the Selma March started. So this was right at the point where the highway started. And you can see that behind a series of Andrew Young and Reverend Abernathy and Coretta Scott King and Dr. King and John Lewis, there's only a small group of people behind them because there's only 300 people who were allowed to cross on the highway to Montgomery. There were a lot of reporters and things like that. There were only about 1,000 people at the start of the Selma March. When they got to Montgomery, there were 25,000 maybe people. It was like a glorious event. But it's really those 300 people who are responsible for the change in the Voting Rights Acts. This was King on the march, and this was just a protester on the march. And this was one of my favorite pictures on the march, just because I feel such a strong dignity in the face of the marchers in the rain. And another picture which has become popular, and it really exemplified to me what it was all about, in the sense of the vote on his forehead, the white chalk on his face, and just a look in his eyes. Rosa Parks was in the Selma March. This was a boy I saw with a flag on the side. You could see the start of the march into Montgomery. And this is a picture I particularly liked with this group of white office workers. I don't know who they were exactly, but you just see the division. These are two groups watching the march at exactly the same time. And they have different attitudes as to what is happening. When the march was approaching Montgomery, Andrew Young said that only people who wore black jackets could be in the front row. And a lot of celebrities were very miffed about this because they felt they really should be in the front row. But the reason was simply that Andrew was afraid that someone might try to shoot King. And he felt that if everyone looked somewhat the same, any potential shooter would not know who he was or which one he was. I'm sorry, I went too fast there. This is just at the end of the march, sitting on the steps of the Montgomery Capitol building is A. Philip Randolph, John Lewis, Coretta Scott King, and Dr. King. It's a picture I only found recently, and it really is, there it was all over. When Dr. King was killed, I was in New York, and Life magazine heard that he had been shot. And they asked me to go immediately to Memphis, and I did that. And the first thing I saw, I arrived there in the morning, very early, and the first thing I saw was the room from which the bathroom, upstairs bathroom, from which the shot had been fired. And the assailant had leaned his gun on the windowsill, and he had stood in the bathtub, and I saw this black handprint on the wall, which could only be made by someone standing in the bathtub, which is not what you usually do. And I photographed it, and Life ran a full-page picture of the handprint. And then I went next door to the Lorraine Motel, and I went to Dr. King's room, and Hosea Williams, who was one of King's aides, let me in. And I saw on a ledge Dr. King's notebook, his attaché case. And there are two books in there. Actually, I'd done the cover of one of them, and it had a magazine and also hairspray. And I saw that on the side there were rumpled shirts, rumpled worn shirts.
Picture isn't up there.
Huh?
That picture isn't up there yet.
Oh, that picture isn't up there? Sorry.
There it is.
There it is, I'm sorry. And I saw these rumpled shirts and these old styrofoam cups just lying there in an uneaten sandwich. And suddenly Dr. King's image came on behind the announcer. And I photographed it all as one picture because to me, the physical man was gone forever. His material things remained, and yet his spirit and his voice still hovered above us. And it's one of the pictures I care most about, really. I also happened to photograph William Buckley. And there he is with a copy of the National Review.
Isn't up yet.
Oh, it's not up yet? Oh, I'm sorry. Do I have to do that? No, I have to do this. There we go. So this is William Buckley in New York. And I did just a few pictures, but they really, particularly these next ones, really represented to me the attitudes I felt about Buckley at the time, or really just who he was, because this is how he looked all the time. And so I did some of these photographs and also photographed him on his boat, and I just ended this with God is Love. So all of them, all these pictures are in the Fire Next Time book, which has James Baldwin's Complete Fire Next Time, and an introduction by John Lewis and something written by his sister as while he was writing the book. Great.
I'll steal the clicker from you, the clicker.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry.
No worries, no worries.
This is a great book.
Oh, thank you. Well, I want to thank the American Writers Museum for hosting us. This is just an incredible experience. What a wonderful space as we're thinking about two really important American writers. To be in this space is really inspiring, and to be here with Steve is just. I just when Allison told me Steve would be here tonight, it was just I kept pinching myself. I mean, this is such a wonderful opportunity to meet Steve, but also I was thinking about the work that Steve's done over the years, and thinking about that work through the lens that Baldwin provides. And Baldwin, I mean, I would say two of the most. Baldwin described himself sometimes as a witness. He said, "My job is to write it all down." And Steve is really one of the great American witnesses. I mean, he has taken these photographs, and those photographs, I think, also capture a couple things that really mattered to Baldwin. Baldwin said that the role of the artist is to sort of capture humanity in all its complexity. And I think that Baldwin, of course, did that beautifully with words, and Steve has done that so beautifully with photography. I mean, I don't think you can really capture the depth of humanity in this period. We just saw just a small example of what Steve's done over the years, and just capturing, as he said, just that image of those young folks, the dignity in their faces. We don't know the names of those folks, but the dignity in their faces, what a story that is. And the other thing that really mattered to Baldwin is that we come to grips with our history, right? That was one of his most important injunctives, the things that he really wanted us to do. And I think in terms of coming to terms with our history, the work that Steve's done to chronicle that history, I think, is without parallel.
Talk about you.
I just want to say that. That's important for me to say that. That's the most important thing. So I think, I don't know, time-wise, I know, well, we're good. Okay. So yeah, I'll just talk a little bit about the book and just give you a sense of what it is and a little bit of the story, and then we'll have time for folks who are able to stick around and talk with Steve and I, have Q&A, and Steve and I can talk a little bit. That's great, and then we're more than happy to sign books and in the back. But the book itself, The Fire is Upon Us, is the hook for the book is this space right here. This is the Cambridge Union in England on the campus of the University of Cambridge. And this space, 55 years ago, next Tuesday, we'll be marking the 55th anniversary of the Baldwin-Buckley debate. This space, February 18th, 1965, was filled. It was so full you couldn't actually recognize the space. If you watch the BBC recording of what happened that night, the floors are almost completely covered. So all the spots on the benches are filled with students. All the spots in the galleries. This is the Cambridge Union is one of the world's oldest debating societies, and so this room is absolutely packed with people. And most of the people there that night were there to see James Baldwin, who was was the poet prophet of the Civil Rights Revolution. And so the students were drawn by the idea of seeing Baldwin, in the flesh. But they were also intrigued by the fact that he would be sharing the platform with William F. Buckley Jr. And Buckley was not as well known at the time, but he was, the sort of rumor around campus was that he would be a worthy foe for Baldwin. And he was somebody who was a very skilled debater and had a radically different worldview. Buckley was understood to be one of the great critics of the Civil Rights Revolution. And so the Cambridge debate that happened February 18, 1965 it constitutes the climactic chapters in the Fire is Upon Us. But as you can see, it's a pretty hefty tome. It's about more than what happened that night. Baldwin and Buckley were born about a year apart from each other. They're almost exact contemporaries. And so what I do in the book is I weave their intellectual biographies against the backdrop of the rise of the civil rights and conservative movements. And then so we start out with that night at Cambridge, and then we end up back there by the end of the book. And so what I wanted to do is take these two individuals who were so important to their respective movements, and they're so prolific in their writings, both their published writings and then the archival material I was able to access, the letters that they wrote, and just sort of private correspondence, that really I was able to get a little glimpse of what they were thinking each day, as they were living through and shaping this history. And so that's what the story is. And I'm going to give you just like a really brief sense of what some of the story that I tell in the book, just to give you a little bit of a peek of what the book's about. So I start the book with Baldwin and Buckley in their younger years. Try to sort of go back to Baldwin's born in 1924, Buckley's born in 1925. They're born in the same city, but I say in the book they may as well have been born on different planets. Baldwin describes growing up in Harlem as the oldest of 9 children, and one of the words that he uses to describe his childhood is claustrophobia. Baldwin said that often he would be sharing one bed with 5 or 6 of his siblings. And so they're living in, like a lot of folks in Harlem, in really difficult conditions. And Baldwin says that, the sort of defining fact of my childhood is that my parents were struggling to feed us, to keep us alive. And so he says that is the most important fact about my childhood. And he watches his father, especially David Baldwin Sr., really consumed by despair. Baldwin says that his father, he dies in 1943, ends up dying in a mental institution. And from James Baldwin's perspective, his father really died of despair. He felt this desperation, this inability to feed his family, and really, Baldwin says he came to believe what the white world said about him, is one of the things that Baldwin concludes about his father. And so Baldwin is somebody who sets out in that context to find a way to escape that fate. And one of the ways he does that, really the way he does that, is through words, right? So here we are in this Museum of American Writers. Baldwin finds in language, he finds in books, first a way to make sense of the world, right? He's reading books all the time. He read every book at the local library, and then began to venture outside of Harlem to libraries where he wasn't supposed to go, to read every single book he could get his hands on. And he was really taken by the power of books to connect people across time and space, and helped him make sense of his own experience. And so Baldwin then begins to write. At age 8, he begins to write and writes and writes and writes until the day he dies. And so part of the story of Baldwin, the story I tell in the book about Baldwin's childhood, is the ways in which he tries to make sense of that experience in Harlem, and the ways in which it provides a foundation for everything that he would do for the rest of his life. Buckley is born in New York City as well. He's born in 1925, November 1925. And Buckley, it's hard to imagine much different circumstances than the circumstances Baldwin described. So Baldwin describes that claustrophobia. Buckley describes seemingly endless space. So most of his childhood is spent at a place called Great Elm in Sharon, Connecticut, 47-acre estate, servants, all sorts of, big mansion, servants, live-in tutors. Buckley describes the experience of growing up in this household. He's one of 10 children. They're, tremendous affluence, tremendous privilege, and he just describes just seemingly endless possibilities, right? They are taught every subject under the sun right there in their own home with the live-in tutors and visiting tutors. They're out, they're learning, a part of the day, and they're out, riding horses and things like that. The rest of the day swimming. And so Buckley describes this experience of growing up in this tremendous affluence, and he describes the worldview he was taught along with that experience, right? And his parents taught him, and there's a lot of detail we could get into in the Q&A if you'd like, but he's taught by his parents that there are some people in the world fit to rule, and there are others fit to be ruled. And guess what? Buckley children, you are fit to rule. And so one of the things his parents teach him is, in terms of his obligations, his obligation is to defend that worldview. Right? They say that worldview is what has made this worldview is what has made this tremendous affluence possible for us, and you need to go out there and defend it. So Buckley doesn't quite want to become his father, but he wants to defend the worldview his father taught him. And like Baldwin, this is one commonality with Baldwin. He has a great skill with words, with language, and he goes out into the world and in a variety of different ways tries to use words to defend this worldview. And he will, from the very beginning, see people like Baldwin as threats to that worldview, and that's and so it builds up the tension as we work our way toward the debate itself. Buckley, just very quickly, Buckley went on. He left that childhood estate, one of his parents' many estates, and he ended up at Yale. And when he's at Yale, he takes it as his purpose to really criticize the American higher education, right? So he shows up at Yale and he says, I was taught by my parents to believe in Christianity and individualism, and I expected my professors at Yale to reinforce those beliefs, but I often found my professors were skeptical about Christianity and individualism, even hostile to Christianity and individualism. And so Buckley takes it to be his purpose to push back against that kind of establishment view. And he says, he writes for the student newspaper. He becomes the editor of the Yale Daily News. He's a debater at Yale as well. And what he tries to do is use language to defend this worldview, to defend that hierarchical worldview his parents had taught him. And he even goes on to graduate from Yale, and the first thing he does is write a book-length indictment of his alma mater, right? So he writes God and Man at Yale, in which he says that the idea of academic freedom is a hoax, needs to be overthrown. We need to break free of this paradox of parents, Christian individualist parents, sending their children off to college only to become atheistic socialists. And so Buckley calls for the overthrow of academic freedom and the imposition of what he calls an orthodoxy. And Buckley, this idea of orthodoxy is really crucial to understanding Buckley's worldview. He believes that any sane society is a society that's closed. There are some ideas that cannot be expressed. And so Buckley goes on to write the next book he writes after God and Man at Yale that attacks academic freedom. The next book, if that wasn't controversial enough, the next book is a defense of Joseph McCarthy. So he writes McCarthy and His Enemies, which is a defense of Joseph McCarthy. And Buckley says, look, McCarthy's not perfect, but he's enforcing a public orthodoxy that needs to be enforced. And so Buckley, he writes these two books, becomes a kind of figure on the national scene at a very young age, much like Baldwin in that regard. But a lot of the people in the establishment, of course, don't like what he has to say, but he proves to be impossible to ignore. And so Buckley's out there defending this worldview, while Baldwin's getting his start as a writer in the late 40s and early 50s. These guys arrive on the intellectual scene at almost precisely the same moment. And Baldwin, for his part, is what he wants to do is he wants to write a novel. He wants to write a novel that captures his experience growing up in Harlem. And he does eventually succeed in doing that. It's called Go Tell on the Mountain. For those who haven't read it, definitely recommend that you do. Baldwin writes, he wants to be a great fiction writer, but he also is getting his start as a nonfiction writer. He's writing book reviews, he's writing essays. And in the fiction, the nonfiction, really the key, I think, to understanding what Baldwin's up to is he's really obsessed with a kind of nexus of three things: identity, morality, and power. Baldwin is always really focused on what he calls the question of identity. Who is it that we take ourselves to be? As individuals and as members of groups. Who do we take ourselves to be? And then the related question of how does our construction of identity lead us to treat other people? And he's very interested in the connection between those two things. And the background of those two things are these big questions of power. Who has power? Who doesn't? Why? And what can we do about it if that power distribution is not justified? And so Baldwin, really what he concludes about human nature is that most of us, most of the time, are in a state of identity crisis, that we really don't want to come to terms with who we really are. So what we tend to do is create identities that make us feel safe, right? And Baldwin thinks these identities are fundamentally often false identities, but they're identities that we construct using mythology, using ideology, in order to make ourselves feel safe, and often to make ourselves feel superior to others. So Baldwin says we are constantly relying on this idea of status, right? If we can frame our own identity in a way that makes us feel superior to someone else, then that will make us, but for a moment, feel safe. Now Baldwin says the trouble with that is it's not going to work, right? We're always going to be in a state of status anxiety. We're always going to be haunted by the idea that someone somewhere is going to have reason to feel superior to us. And so Baldwin, basically what he says is this is the human conundrum. This is what we need. If you want to understand racism, you want to understand homophobia, xenophobia, any ideology of exclusion, at the core is that human paradox, right? That fear that we have. And so Baldwin, that's what he's up to in all the writings, the fiction, the nonfiction. He's grappling with those sorts of questions. You have Buckley over here thinking about this idea of a public orthodoxy that needs to be enforced, and you have Baldwin over here thinking about these questions of identity. And so they're thinking about very different things, but you can kind of see why they might end up on a collision course, and indeed they are. Buckley's really the most important role that he plays in American political history is as one of my colleagues puts it, as the editor of American conservatism. So when Buckley's getting his start, there really is nothing we can call a coherent American conservative movement. Buckley is in that sense really a founding father of the American conservative movement. And one of the ways he plays that role is as the editor of a magazine. So he writes those two books. They do quite well, but he's frustrated by the glacial pace of book publishing, and he wants to have an impact on day-to-day politics. And what he really wants is he wants a magazine of his own. He tries being a journalist, working for somebody else, but Buckley, remember, there's some people fit to rule, others fit to be ruled. Buckley was not cut out to be anyone's employee, so that lasts about 4 months. Most of us, if we want to have a magazine of our own, that's not something we can afford. Fortunately, Buckley had those very wealthy parents who gave him an advance on his inheritance. So he founds National Review, in the first issue appears in November 1955. And that what's important to note about that is that this magazine proves to be a kind of a way for the conservative movement to organize itself. And Buckley becomes kind of an intellectual bouncer. Who's going to be allowed in? Who's going to be allowed out? Who's going to be edited out of conservatism, and who's going to be part of it? And if you think about the timing, when he's launching the magazine, 1954 is when he's fundraising and putting together the editorial staff. 1955, this is right in the sort of moment when the latest phase in the civil rights movement is taking off, right? Brown versus Board, the school desegregation decision in 1954, the conservative backlash against that decision in the South, the rise of the white citizens councils and so on, the Southern Manifesto in Congress, you have the arrest of Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott, the lynching of Emmett Till. All of that is happening right in the same months when Buckley is founding National Review. And so Buckley, as the editor of this new conservative magazine, as the founder of American conservatism, has to decide what the magazine's going to have to say about race and civil rights. And what I always make sure to point out here is it's not a foregone conclusion that someone founding a conservative magazine in 1955 will be hostile to civil rights. There were conservative, right, the leading partisan faction resisting civil rights were Southern Democrats. Buckley thought of himself as a Republican. There were many people who thought of themselves as conservative Republicans who were actually quite favorable to civil rights, including William F. Noland, who was one of Buckley's political heroes, who actually wanted Noland to run on Eisenhower's right in 1956. He wanted him to primary Eisenhower. Noland was somebody who thought of himself as friendly to civil rights. But Buckley chooses a very different course, and that course is really what sets him on this collision course with Baldwin. Buckley, and this is something I get into a lot of detail in the book, and I won't get into it right now, but Buckley, from the word go, everything in the magazine, almost everything in the magazine, is hostile to civil rights. So the magazine makes very clear they're against the Brown v. Board school desegregation decision. They're against any federal intervention, whether it's by Congress or by the courts, in order to challenge segregation in the South. They end up being against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, against the Voting Rights Act of 1965, critics of the Freedom Riders, critics of the sit-in protesters, critics of Martin Luther King. One exception is they are okay with economic boycotts. They think that's a legitimate form of social protest. But other than that, they're critical at just about every turn. And they offer a lot of rationales for this. And I'll just give you the one that Buckley gives us in his perhaps his most infamous piece in 1957, Why the South Must Prevail. Buckley says that, and this is on my first slide, so I will quote him directly. Buckley says, as you can see here better than I can, and I will, the white community in the South is entitled to take such measures as are necessary to prevail politically and culturally because for the time being it is the advanced race. And so Buckley makes this explicitly, white supremacist argument in defense of his position, and he says in that piece that essentially the obligation that supersedes all other obligations is the preservation of quote-unquote civilization. And white people in the South, he argues, are more civilized, and so they have the right, not only the right, but the duty to exclude African Americans from voting and from other aspects of full citizenship. And Buckley takes that view, and in some ways, he has all sorts of rationales for that view, but at the bottom of all of them is an assumption that some lives matter more than others, right? And that's one of the things I argue in the book, is that there is this kind of there's this explicit white supremacy you can see in comments like that, but there's kind of an implicit white supremacy in all sorts of other arguments that Buckley makes. And so Buckley, he defends that view in every way that he can, in writing and speeches and debates. And what I get into in the book is the ways in which Buckley and this crew that I have pictured up there, and it goes from, he cozies up to everybody from, James Jackson Kilpatrick and Strom Thurmond, the leading segregationist figures, to William J. Simmons, who was the head of the White Citizens Council. Buckley is trying to figure out with all these folks how to resist black liberation. And so they're rationalizing this intransigence. Right at that very moment, Baldwin is making his first trip to the American South. So Baldwin lives, he calls himself a transatlantic commuter, but he lives in Paris most of the time from 1948 to 1957. 1957, he feels obliged to come back and really devote himself to the civil rights struggle in first as a journalist, right? He wants to play this role as a witness. And I think Steve got to see Baldwin at this moment where his sort of role as a witness and his role as a kind of activist are really in some ways both operating. But Baldwin, the first thing he does is he goes down to the South, and one of the really remarkable moments for me as a writer was going from this really deep dive into the Buckley and his world and how they were justifying their resistance to black liberation, going from that to Baldwin sitting in the living room of a 15-year-old boy who's one of the first African-American students in a previously all-white school in Charlotte, North Carolina. Baldwin describes sitting in this living room, looking this 15-year-old boy in the eyes and trying to understand what the world looks like through those eyes. So he says that this young man has had to confront white students forming a barricade at the front of the school when he's just trying to attend his classes. He's been subject to verbal and physical assaults on a regular basis in this new school. And Baldwin just wants to know how this young man manages to grapple with what Baldwin calls what's surely the most difficult moment of his day, the morning when he wakes and realizes it all has to be gone through again. And so Baldwin wants to try to get a sense from this young man of what that's like. What does the world look like through those eyes? And then he wants to talk to the young man's mother, who's in the room, and she's one of only a few dozen African-American parents in a city with 50,000 African-American people who even applied for this integration program. So in some sense, she sent her son marching toward that white barricade. And Baldwin, as the oldest of 9 siblings, often was fascinated by and haunted by, as Steve pointed out, what the world looks like through the eyes of a parent like this young man's mother. Baldwin was wondering how she had the audacity, how she had the courage to put her family in this situation. And so he talks to her for a while. And then Baldwin goes from there to sit down with the white principal of the school. And Baldwin goes into that meeting wanting to try to understand what the world looks like through his eyes. And he gets a sense pretty quickly that this guy is not a rabid segregationist. He's a relatively young principal. Integration is against everything he's ever known. But Baldwin says he seems like a gentle human being. He seems like even an honorable human being. But Baldwin says he also is a delusional human being because he's unable really to see the humanity of this young man who's just trying to get an education. And so Baldwin says, he wants to try to understand, though. This is part of capturing the complexity of human nature. He says, I want to try to understand how this principal is understanding his role in this drama that's unfolding, and how can understanding the way he views the world help us make the world a more humane place. So Baldwin and Buckley, and this is in the period that most of the photographs that Steve showed us, the book, as I get further on in history, the chapters cover smaller and smaller slices of time because so much is happening in 1962, 1963, 1964, and Baldwin and Buckley are really right at the center of this history. And so what I try to do is give the readers a sense of how they're living through and shaping this history. And there are so many examples that I found especially powerful as I was writing, and I'll just give you 2, and then I don't know if we'll be able to get. I could play a clip from the debate if the technology will cooperate, and then we can have a conversation. But just to give you a sense of a couple of these moments in this period when Buckley and Baldwin are kind of in the eye of the storm, as I say here. On the Baldwin side, there's a moment in late 1962. So going back to one of Steve's photographs of Baldwin standing with James Meredith, right, when Steve was traveling with Baldwin in early '63. James Meredith was an African-American Air Force veteran who wanted to attend the University of Mississippi. And in late '62, he tries to register for classes at Ole Miss, and all hell breaks loose. You have what's known as the battle at Ole Miss. You have an armed rebellion, an armed insurrection against integration. And so, people are killed. Many people are injured. Many people are arrested. And Baldwin, just weeks after that happens, finds himself in a television studio in New York, sitting across the table from this guy right here, the upper left, James Jackson Kilpatrick. James Jackson Kilpatrick was rightly called by his biographer the leading salesman for segregation. Kilpatrick had devoted his professional life to doing all he could to defend segregation. He was on the lecture circuit. He was an editor of a newspaper in Virginia. He was in which he would write, editorials basically every day of the week defending segregation. He was writing books defending segregation. So Baldwin is in this studio in New York in late 1962, sitting across the table from the leading salesman for segregation. And it's just one of these remarkable moments of Baldwin doing his thing. And Baldwin is sitting there, and he says the first thing he says, they're welcome to the show. And this is something that hasn't been written very much about. Actually, Baldwin himself, his archive in Harlem, he kept a full transcript of this exchange, which was just like one of those moments when I was doing the research that just was jaw-dropping. So Baldwin, they're welcome to the show, and Baldwin looks Kilpatrick in the eyes, and he says, "You think there's a difference between men like you, who wear nice suits and write fancy books, and the people in the streets committing acts of racist violence?" Baldwin says, "There is no difference. In fact, I hold you, sir, to be far more responsible than the people in those streets. The people in those streets are operating under a delusion that they don't really understand. Everything they've been taught is that their value as human beings is attached to their whiteness. And you, sir, have been weaving those webs of delusion. He says to Kilpatrick, I accuse you not of betraying me, James Baldwin, or people who look like me. I accuse you of betraying them. You are depriving those people of meaningful lives." That's how he starts the conversation. And then from there, he just plays the role of cross-examining prosecutor with Kilpatrick and criticizes his white supremacist views. And one of the really remarkable moments at the end of the conversation is that Kilpatrick he describes himself, and I should say Kilpatrick was one of Buckley's go-to guys on race, right? He's like one of Buckley's favorite writers on race. And Baldwin says to Kilpatrick, you call yourself a conservative, but what is it that you are trying to conserve? And Kilpatrick says, well, I'm trying to conserve Western civilization. White people are best positioned to conserve Western civilization. And Baldwin says, this is the second betrayal, right? I accuse you of betraying Western civilization. Whatever is good in Western civilization, whether it's what's best in the Judeo-Christian tradition that you claim to care about, Mr. Kilpatrick, whatever is best in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, you are betraying those values. You are undermining those values. You are destroying those values. The people who are actually defending those values are those young people in the streets who are fighting for their freedom. Baldwin. And so in that's an example of the kind of thing that Baldwin's up to. Buckley is, in this period, I think one of the things that's really was, really powerful for me was looking at Buckley in slow motion, in some depth. He gives us so much to work with, right? He has a newspaper column 3 times a week. He's editing the magazine. He's giving all these speeches. And so and he's writing letters, all these letters, interoffice memos, all these things are in his archive at Yale. And so you can really get a peek into his mind as he's working through